My name is Luke Howe, and on behalf of the undergraduate government of Boston College, I would like to thank you for coming out tonight, and I would also like to welcome you to a night with Alan Keyes. As an undergraduate government, we see it as our duty to represent all students on this campus. In order to do this, it is necessary to bring a variety of speakers to campus, representing different political backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds. It is our hope that these speakers will help to inspire intellectual thought, both inside and outside the classroom. Many of you have heard the voices of Noam Chomsky and Michael Moore, and tonight you will hear from a prominent ambassador, talk show host, presidential candidate, Catholic, Harvard grad, family man, columnist, assistant secretary of state, author, conservative, commentator, and most important to many of you, a Red Sox fan. Serving as the ambassador to the United Nations, being the first African American to be subject to an exploratory committee by the Republican National Presidential Nomination in 1996, serving as president of Citizens Against the Government Waste, and a host of the Alan Keyes Show, America's Wake-Up Call. Alan Keyes is here tonight to share his views with us at Boston College. It is my honor and privilege tonight to present to you Dr. Alan Keyes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I must say that introduction reminds me in a way of something someone once said about somebody else who was part of a generation of folks who were public servants and diplomats in the generation before mine, and he had a long list of jobs that he had held and so forth. And as somebody was reading his introduction at a function I was at, somebody leaned over to me and says, "I guess that proves he couldn't hold the job for more than 2 or 3 years." And maybe after I get done, you'll know why. I don't know. But what I am going to spend the next few minutes sharing with you, I have to be quite blunt about it, is gloom. But I don't do it only in the spirit that misery loves company. I do it in the spirit that sometimes looking at the reality of what you are faced with can help to lead to an outcome that won't be quite so gloomy. Now, why would I be feeling gloomy? I've got to tell you, you all live in Massachusetts. If you don't know why I'm feeling gloomy, you must not be reading the newspapers. This state represents, as I just said to someone in the other room, if you were looking around to find the place where you could get a hold of the thread that somebody's going to pull on to dissolve both the liberty and the civilization of the United States, I think it is quite clear that that thread has emerged in our time in Massachusetts. And there are people who are vigorously pulling upon it, even as we speak, in such a way that if they succeed, and I'm not entirely sure they will, there's going to be a big battle. There's going to be an ongoing controversy that will reach an intensity that we're not used to in America because of the nature of these issues is going to become, I think, quite something. But it is either going to be a battle that leads to a refreshing of our commitment to the foundations of our free way of life, or it's going to result in their destruction. But there will be no in-between. It's going to be one or the other. The end result will be that in the 21st century, this republic, which I think one could, and I know there are people who would argue with this, but you look over the history of the 20th century, and it's quite clear that some really, really bad, evil possibilities would have triumphed in the world if America hadn't existed. And if we get turned, which we are in the process, sadly, of doing if we're not careful, that means that those principles of evil will have no focus of opposition here in the 21st century. And that does not portend well for the human race. Now, why do I say these things? Well, I say them because I actually believe in freedom and self-government. And I think that America, as a country that started out, at least, on the basis of ideas and principles that were dedicated to realizing the capacity, as the founders put it, of humankind for self-government, that it is a regime that at the end of the day is worthy of support and loyalty and service precisely because it is committed to the realization of this essential element of all human dignity. I think it's impossible, in fact, to be a human being in the true sense of the term if your freedom is not recognized and respected. Now, I say that for a number of reasons. I say it in part because I've spent a lot of time reading this philosopher and that one, and that seems to be one lesson one can draw from the speculations of some very wise people. But I also say it because I'm a Christian and a Catholic, and I believe in God as he is presented to us in the Scripture. And the fascinating thing about the God of the Scripture is that if you think it through, he placed an enormous, some might even argue an inordinate, importance on freedom. I don't think we reflect on this enough. We especially don't reflect on it enough as Americans. And those of us who are Christians or Catholic, we don't reflect on it enough as Christians. We don't think about the fact that if you go back to the very beginning of the Bible, when the creation account is given, particularly the creation of man, it is a creation account. We all know the gist of it, right? There they were, living in paradise, all happy and pleased. Then Eve decides that she's got to listen to the serpent, eat the apple. There's the fall. They're punished, kicked out, so forth and so on. We go through it in that simple-minded way. And of course, like Dr. Watson in the Sherlock Holmes stories, we miss everything of importance that it has to tell us. Right? And in one sense, that's not quite how it happened. Yes, indeed, there is an account of creation. And yes, indeed, there is an account of the creation of man. But it's a complex account. It's a complex account. If you'll recall, the man, Adam, is subject of God's creation, as I recall it, on the sixth day. And he fashions him, brings him up out of the ground, and breathes life into him. And then, unlike the rest of his work, which he kind of looked at it and he immediately knew, that's good. And he just rested. That's good, I'm done. He looks at man and he doesn't say this. He looks at man and instead of just saying, that's good, he puts him to the test. He puts him to the test. Not exactly with a blue book, but it was almost as bad because he decides he's going to test him and he brings before him. You remember this? It's actually the beasts and the creatures of the air. Someday you should go back to Genesis and think a little about why the creatures of the sea are left out. Because Adam does not get to name the creatures of the sea. He names the beasts and he names the birds of the air. He doesn't name the creatures of the sea. These are brought before him. And the text tells us, whatever Adam calls them, that is what they are called. Now, of course, we read through this with our usual kind of nonchalant acceptance of things. Does it ever occur to you to ask yourself what could possibly be meant by naming in a context where no language exists, where no need for communication could possibly exist, where it is even absurd to ask whether Adam spoke English or Russian or French because the very idea of language has no place whatsoever? What was he doing when he named those animals? Mm-hmm. And being as how God had already created them all, what did Adam have to add to it? Well, one lesson we do learn, because it's explicitly drawn in the Scripture. And that lesson is that after he goes through this whole process, and whatever he calls these birds and beasts, that is what they are called, it tells us that he finds no one like himself. None of them is like him. None of them is like him. And at that point, God says something very significant in the Scripture. He says, it is not good that man should be alone. That's actually quite startling. I mean, here's God. And he's sort of like, I don't know, the scene from the beginning of that movie, The Patriot, where Mel Gibson is trying to make a chair and he sits in it and it collapses. And he gets up and kind of looks back at it, obviously knowing that he has just produced a product of inferior workmanship. The notion that God produces a product of inferior workmanship ought to be a little bit shocking. After all, he is in our understanding of him, absolute, all-powerful, omniscient. He can't make mistakes. And yet, here's Adam. He put him through his traces, and he comes to a conclusion. It is not good. That basically means that he comes to the conclusion that what he's got in front of him isn't done. It's not finished. It's not finished. Not perfect. Because, of course, that is the implication, isn't it, of saying something's not good. It also has another implication we'll get to in a minute. And then he puts him to sleep and creates woman. And as a consequence of that creation, we are then told that this is done, and a phrase is used that ought to strike us more forcibly, I think, than it does. Because the Scripture tells us, when it's all done, it says, male and female he created them. In the image and likeness of God created he them. Why is it that most of the time when we think this passage through, we don't make the connection that the passage itself makes? We think of them as the males and females we kind of know, and so forth and so on. And it doesn't occur to us that the reason that Adam wasn't done and that woman had to be created is that phrase, male and female he created them, in the image and likeness of God created he them, that could not have been spoken of Adam before woman was created. What does that mean? Well, it means, doesn't it, or at least it suggests, that except unless the man and the woman were created in that complex relationship of difference within unity, then man would not be in the image and likeness of God. Right? We think that phrase tells us something about man. No. We need to understand that if it is as if man is a mirror held up to the Creator, then what was required in order to perfect our humanity tells us something about God. Now, I want to indulge in a little aside here that will introduce you to a little bit of something I'm going to be talking about later. If you think about what I just went through and you go back and you look at it and you find that it has some validity, it ought to pose a serious problem for you in the context of our contemporary discussion. That is, if you are, in fact, a person of faith. I'm making certain assumptions here, which I will make with greater shamelessness since I am speaking at a Catholic university. But that doesn't mean I won't be wrong, but I'll make them anyway. But we are confronted here by something that would suggest, wouldn't it, that even though in our present discussion we try to treat the sexual distinction as if it were kind of incidental, in that scriptural discussion, it turns out to be essential. And not essential to only our human nature, no. It turns out to be essential to a right understanding of God. Because our human nature, once woman was created, could be declared by God to be finished and to be an image and likeness of God. Suggesting that in the absence of that sexual distinction, that image and likeness was not complete. Right? That means that the difference over homosexuality and gay marriage, and especially within the Christian religion, is a theological dispute. Those who assert that that distinction is not essential are rejecting the Bible's understanding of who God is and what we are in relation to him. That's heavy. Right? But it gets to be more than that from our American point of view. Why? Because of what follows. What follows in the Scripture is, of course, the fall. And an account that has, in the usual trivial way that people will do it, they look at that account and they say, well, she was to blame and she did this and that. Now, why do we think it through from the point of view of that it is told? Well, Man could not be complete without woman. When complete, he was fashioned in the Scripture tells us in the image and likeness of God. And that would mean that the particular account of a problem that is associated with the woman and her existence, as it were, is actually an account of a problem that arises from the perfection of our nature. Right? When our nature is fashioned by God in such a way as to be perfect, to be complete, and to reflect Him in its image, then another difficulty arises. And what is that difficulty? Well, we always go right to the fact that, the difficulty is that God says, don't eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and Eve eats it, and because she disobeyed God, she's thrown out, and that's it. And again, like Dr. Watson, I would argue, we miss everything of importance. What's the most important question to ask about this whole situation? Well, God's omnipotent. He's omniscient. It is quite clear from the text that He knew good and well what might happen if He put that tree of knowledge of good and evil there in the garden. So isn't the most important question we have to ask not a question of what did Eve do, but a question of why did God do this? Why did He put the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden? When He knew what could happen. When He knew that it put man in the presence of a temptation so great that He had to warn against it. Now, it's one of those wonderful things they say about laws, that usually you don't make a law unless it's needed. So when God issues this warning, don't eat that fruit, He's issuing the warning because He knows that you're going to be tempted to eat it no matter what He says. And He figures, let me put some weight behind us, then maybe they'll resist. Well, no. But why is it there? The tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, to think it through fully, you'd have to think a little bit about what good and evil could possibly be in the context of the Scripture at that point. Right? What could evil possibly be in the context of a state or condition of being in which there is just God and the good world that He's created? Because He's declared it all to be good, right? Didn't He declare everything to be good by the time you're done? Everything He created is good. He's good. We're right there in the beginning, and we're in the presence of what is good, absolutely good, simply good, perfectly good. How on earth can evil enter into this? How can it be? What could the knowledge of good and evil possibly mean in a context where, in one sense, there is only God and His good works? Right? That's a tough question, isn't it? I think it rather is. We don't think about it enough. Because it's a question that would then arise. We know all about evil. See, that's why we looked this one over. Because we can't recapture that pristine moment standing there when this whole business of evil was not to be taken for granted. When the existence of a tree of knowledge of good and evil seems to contradict the very state or condition that the Scripture has presented us with, which is God and His good works and nothing else. Right? So what is this knowledge of good and evil? Well, in one sense, as we are seeing, good is that which what? Comes of God. And if evil is different than good, then I suppose evil must be that which in some sense comes from somewhere else. Though how that's possible in the presence of an absolute being is another question we'd have to think about really hard. But in any case, it puts man in the presence of a temptation. But we might be well advised to think of that temptation in terms of what it implies about the human consciousness of the world that God has created and of himself or herself in that world. See? And the possibility that the serpent represents in that consciousness, coming along and sidling up to Eve and saying, Eve, look, he told you not to eat that fruit, but if you eat it, then you shall be as gods. Right? What should Eve have said to the serpent? When the serpent said, if you eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will be as God. You will be like God. What should Eve have said? Based on what we know from the Scripture. If she were in full possession of knowledge of herself, what would she have said? Excuse me, serpent, I'm already like God. That tree can't get me anything I don't already have. Shouldn't have bothered with it. See? But Eve forgets herself. She forgets herself. It's also symbolized, I think, in the text by an argument from silence, as it can be called. Because in that particular moment, who's silent? In the discussion between Eve and the serpent, who's silent? Adam! Where's Adam? See? Where's Adam? Well, Adam is an element. A matter of fact, the relationship between man and woman is so complete, their unity is implied by the Scripture to be so complete, that at several points in the Genesis account, man and woman are referred to collectively by one name, not by two. That is truly a representative of the fact, isn't it? Because we are man and woman, but we are all of us human. We represent in our distinction a unity. And if that unity is real, if you put a question to Eve, the woman, then you have also put the same question to Adam, only Eve forgets herself. That is to say, she forgets her Adam. And she goes ahead and acts in such a way as to what? As to present some notion that she can only be complete if she does something God has not already done. And yet we know that she herself exists only because in order for man to be complete, God knew exactly what to do. But the real point I'm making here, some of this you could think through in another context, I suppose, but the real point I'm making is actually, though, about this tree of knowledge of good and evil that she eats of, and that then exposes Adam and Eve to a consciousness of themselves that leads to a sense of their distinction from God and ultimately to their loss of the consciousness of unity with Him that constitutes their existence in paradise. And all of this comes about because Eve makes a choice that assumes that there is a difference, a non-likeness at some essential level between herself and God. But how would that be possible? If God's omniscient and absolute, how can one posit a difference with God? See? At one level, one could only posit a difference with God if God helps you. If He lends you the being that constitutes that difference, like Rush Limbaugh, talent on loan from God. Right? So the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which places man in the way of this temptation, allows Eve to do what? Allows her to make a choice. It allows her to make a choice between that which is of God and that which is otherwise. A choice that at one level is a contradiction, but that at another level exemplifies what? What do we say choice is the essence of? It is the essence of freedom. In the absence of choice, there is no freedom. And that means that the tree of knowledge of good and evil puts man, in this case exemplified through the woman, in a position where there is a capacity for, a potential for, a possibility of freedom. Understood as what? God has posited the world thus, but you can fancy it otherwise. Why is this freedom needed? Well, see, I think that's also clear when you think it through, because God is omniscient and misunderstanding, all-powerful, and so forth and so on. He has created the world, and that account is given, but here's the question. Given that God is an absolute and all-powerful being, could He have created a different world? Could He have created another world? Could He have created a world opposite to this world in every respect? Well, intellectually, I think it is necessary to answer that question. Yes, He could have. Otherwise, we would be denying Him that absoluteness in power. So it turns out that absolute freedom goes with absolute power. And that in one sense, though you are able to determine yourself to be thus, the fact that you determine yourself to be thus in no way impairs your power to determine yourself to be otherwise. And this is a kind of difficult and mysterious possible self-contradiction that we must nonetheless ascribe to the omnipotent God. And here's the final point. God made man in his image and likeness. Would that image and likeness have been in any way accurate or complete if the freedom of God had not been part of the image that he imprints upon human nature? No. That means that right there in the Genesis story, it turns out that God, in order to make us what he means us to be, had to put us in a situation in which freedom was possible for us, even though he knew that by our abuse of that freedom we might destroy the consciousness of our unity and identity with him that makes our perfect peace and happiness possible. Now, as Americans, this tale, and by America I mean that country conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, etc., a country, therefore, that at one level is all about freedom. We've known this since it was founded. It turns out that being all about freedom has a theological significance. Because in being all about freedom, we are all about that which God thought to be so important as an element of our human nature that he risked the perfect peace and happiness of the beginning, so that we would truly reflect this attribute which could not be denied to him and which therefore had to be included in us. And the reason I think that this whole story revolves around the woman is because of a very simple and in some ways simple-minded truth. If you're only presented with one alternative, you don't have a choice. In order for there to be a choice, there must be a possibility of distinction between one thing and another. And in order for man to be conscious of this possibility, he had to be conscious of distinction in the unity that was himself. So that that possibility of distinction within unity would characterize his understanding of the unity of the world of manifold things with which he was presented. So that that world in his consciousness would be a world of choices. Thus, made for freedom, we were also made for a fall. Made for that choice which would mistake our true nature and destroy our perfect consciousness of identity with our Creator. And all this taking place, by the way, in a context where in order for the consciousness that makes freedom possible to emerge, there had to be what we call the sexual distinction, which actually turns out to be a physical manifestation of a metaphysical distinction that reflects a truth about God himself. But that truth is not complete yet for us. It's not complete because that truth includes one other element, the one that Eve forgot. Because when she forgot Adam, she forgot her other, but she forgot the other element of herself. She forgot the unity that exists between them. Therefore, the presence of man and the presence of woman, though two, implies the existence of a third understanding of our human being, a third understanding of our human being in which the man and the woman are seen as one, in which every element of what they are is represented in the whole. What did I just refer to? The child, of course. The missing element. It is implied, by the way, by the moment of sexual distinction. This is something we forget. We repress our recognition of this in things like contraception and abortion. But what we are denying is, in fact, still spiritually and intellectually necessary. in order for one and one to be conscious of unity, for man and woman to know themselves as human beings, they must be able to sublimate their distinction and confront their unity. And that means that in the truest sense, where there is man and where there is woman, there is necessarily the idea of the child. For the child represents their unity, recaptured and reconstituted in such a way as to exist in the presence of their distinction. As Pope John Paul has said to us, by the way, this whole thing ought to remind us of something else, and is meant to, which is what? A concept essential to the Judeo-Christian God, or to the Christian God, rather, which is what? The Trinity. The Trinity. That being as such manifests itself necessarily in three distinct persons. And the recapitulation of that representation in our humanity so that we can be in the image of God is man and woman and the implied existence of that being which unites them, which is the child. Now, I have gone through all of this, see, so that we wouldn't come down to some of these more practical issues, mistaking the background. These days, especially as Christians, we mistake the background for what we're doing. We actually think that when we talk about all the sexual stuff, we're talking about pleasure, hedonism, homosexuality, personal feelings, personal rights, and so forth and so on. This may be true in somebody else's world. But in the world as it is understood in the context of the Scriptures and of the Christ whom we profess to believe in, the sexual distinction is not an incident, it's not an accident, it is an essential manifestation of truth about the nature of being itself, which is God. Deny it, and you have denied God himself. And fascinatingly enough, we are quickly starting to move toward a country in which the statement I just made would have me thrown in jail. They're already thinking about it in Canada. And that means, by the way, that anyone who is going to profess a sincere belief in Christianity will be entering into an era of persecution, where in order to profess the faith, one will have to stand the penalties of those who deny that God is God. And we don't want to forget, do we, in the midst of all of this, that of course it's essential to Christianity, because if there are not three persons in one God, then who is Christ? Christianity is an absurdity without the Trinity, you know that. It is a meaningless kind of thing without the Trinity, because the divinity of Christ is necessarily denied once the Trinity is denied. And therefore, what are we doing here? Now, I'm going through all of this because I know there are people who could have this discussion on a secular basis, and that's all right with me if they want to do it. But that wouldn't necessarily determine the future of America. See, the future of America is still in the hands of people who profess to be Christians. And what I'm wondering about is how people who profess to be Christians can swallow an understanding that requires the denial of the most essential point made in our faith at its very beginning. A point that was made, by the way, by Christ, or referred to by Jesus himself. And it's interesting the context in which he refers to it. You see, he refers to the point about being in the image and likeness of God when he is asked the question about whether or not it is lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not. Remember that? He says, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? He's asked this question by people who are trying to trap him, and they think they've got him, because if he says no, then he's offended Caesar and should be up for treason. And if he says yes, and Caesar was worshipped as a god in the Roman Empire, then he has blasphemed under the Jewish law. And they had him coming and going. So what does he do? But he does an odd thing. He asks for a coin. Sort of like Jerry Maguire. Show me the money. Oh, show me the money. And what's he doing? He looks at the coin. Maybe that's why I found this penny, so that it would be in my pocket when I needed a coin. Who knows? But he looks at the coin, and he says to them, whose image is stamped upon this coin? And they say, Caesar's, of course. And then he says the famous words, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. But you must interpret his words in light of his deeds. You should always do that, by the way, with Christ. Why? Because he is the Word incarnate, the Word made flesh. His deeds are also words, even as he himself is the Word, so that his every deed is a manifestation of God. So, he says, show me the money. He says the image. And what does that do for us? Well, at the very moment that he posits what some people argue is this separation of church and state nonsense, he reminds us of a fundamental truth that absolutely contradicts it. He says, whose image is stamped upon the coin and rendered to Caesar? So we know what we should give to Caesar. We should give to Caesar what has his image stamped upon it, right? That begs the question, doesn't it? It begs the question, what should we give to God? And what's the answer to that question suggested by Christ's own actions? We should give to God that which has his image stamped upon it. And what does that mean? Well, that means that even though he seems to be saying Caesar has some things and God has some things, what he's really saying is that God has everything. God owns Caesar. He owns you. He owns me. He owns everybody. There is no such distinction. And he makes this point, fundamental, by the way, to an understanding of justice in human society, by referring us to this truth we must never forget, that our nature reveals to us something not just about ourselves, but about our God. Now, if I go through all of this, and I know, so, it's awful metaphysical stuff, why are we going through it? It's very simple. Unless you're willing to confront this and think this through seriously, you have no right to be talking about marriage and gay marriage and all this other stuff right now. Because from our point of view, it must be seen against the backdrop of this truth. If it's not, then we're just pretending. And Boston College should long since have given up the Catholic appellation, and the Catholic religion should fold its tent and quietly steal away. What's the point of going through meaningless rituals when we deny the essential truths that give those rituals any significance whatsoever? What's the point of professing a faith, Christ, when we no longer believe a single thing? This is the thing that amazes me about these Episcopalians and others. They are approaching a question like sexuality, and they're saying, well, we're going to be Christians, but we must embrace our homosexual brethren. Yeah, embrace your homosexual brethren by doing what? By rejecting your God. This seems to be a high price to pay for a religion. Well, rather a high price to pay. Why are you rejecting God when you embrace your homosexual brethren? Well, I think it's very clear. Because if we are not two sexes, but as the UN would have it at one point, I was at a women's conference back in 85, and at that point there was a resolution on the table that's had us with 5 genders, I think. Well, hey, look, once we start making it up, it could be as many genders as we want. It's kind of like geometries in math. You can have as many as you like. But in any case, this whole question of the gender distinction, treated as if it has no significance beyond the sexual role, and yet if you embrace it, then one of the things you're saying is that the supposed word of God about who we are was a lie from its very first words spoken about us. Because the very first word spoken about us was male and female, he created them. Not male, female, lesbian, homosexual, disinclined, but male and female, he created them. Simple as that. And point of fact, if that distinction is not essential, then the Scripture is a lie from its very first word about our humanity. You can't have it both ways. I know people in this country think we can, because we don't have to be reasonable. We can say whatever silly nonsense we want. But that doesn't make it true. As the Scripture reminds us, doesn't matter how many people put their hands together to say something that God hasn't said, it doesn't make it true. And that, in essence, is what we're doing. But what we're doing it about, with respect to marriage, is we are denying a truth about the marriage estate. And that truth is very simple. Marriage is not a product of human will. It is a necessary consequence of human nature as it emerged from the will of God. Simple as that. Because the first marriage occurred the moment the woman was created. And the first marriage was consummated the moment the woman was given to Adam. Because in that moment, the two entered into a consciousness that implied that unity, which is then made manifest in our physical world by the third, which is the child. And the denial of the relationship between marriage and procreation then becomes the denial of our essential humanity, meant to express what? The Trinity, meant to express the fact that there can be distinction in the presence of unity, that God in his absoluteness can nonetheless manifest himself in a world of manifold beings, the created world of which we are a part, and yet lose none of his godness, because he has shared that godness with us. These are the issues that we're playing games with now. And the issue of marriage, by the way, isn't an issue just for our republic. The issue of marriage is an issue for all of human civilization. If we go down the road of so-called gay marriage, we will be doing something that, as far as I can tell in my little reading, has never been done before. And I know we have great contempt for every human being who ever came upon the scene before modern science told us all these things we think we know. But it might behoove us to remember we wouldn't even have gotten here for people to be speculating about modern science if some of those people hadn't known what they were doing. And they put together civilizations that lasted for far longer than ours has so far, and in order to be the building blocks that made it possible for us to get here. And one thing that they all seem to agree on, even, by the way, the ones where homosexuality and all this was open, where it was even lauded and applauded and participated in and praised like ancient Greece. Do you know what somebody would have said in ancient Greece if you'd approached them with the concept of homosexual marriage? He wouldn't have said anything. He would have laughed in your face. Laughter is the appropriate response when somebody suggests something absurd. Right? That it's possible to be something that in essence your very existence makes impossible. It is not possible to be married in the absence of the potential for procreation. That doesn't mean the actual fact. It means the possibility. In the absence of that possibility, it is no more possible to be married than it is possible for wood to be iron. Right? If there are these distinctions, then we must respect the essence that makes them possible. And the essence of marriage is the unity of man and woman. Christ, of course, since we're Christians, we should refer to him sometimes, understands it in exactly that way, as I recall. See? For this reason does a man leave his mother and father and cling to his spouse, and the two become one flesh. That is marriage. Absent the potential for that fleshly unity, and he wasn't referring to sex. Sex is not unity. Sex is at best the expression of a yearning desire for a unity it is not possible fully to achieve, except in the completion of that creative act in the birth of the child. Then, by God's means, that unity is fulfilled. It is the longing for that unity which bears fruit in the child's life, in his birth, in his coming to an existence of the child. Apart from the possibility of that fruit, marriage as such has no significance, no meaning, no substance whatsoever. And this means, of course, that the moment that we, as our civilization, start putting that word on some gay relationship, we have destroyed it. We have destroyed. And I'm not making some empirical argument here, all gay people are bad and therefore they'll have bad relations. That doesn't really matter, because what we have destroyed is something that goes beyond human behavior. See, in order for human beings to understand things, we've got to have ideas that are clear. We've got to have concepts that mean something. Apart from those concepts, we are but animals whose only reason is in our members. But with those concepts, we become beings who can grasp the significance of what we do and be held accountable for its consequences. And that, of course, is what marriage is about. Marriage is about not what some people say. No, I don't blame, by the way, the homosexual lobby for this sort of degraded understanding of marriage that we're acting on now. Oh, I blame heterosexuals. Because heterosexuals were the ones who first retreated from the real, proper understanding of marriage. Who first started acting as if marriage is just about pleasure and fulfillment of oneself and the gratification one gets from this or that romantic relationship. That's what marriage is about. And since we have still left over from some archaic past, a little bit of a guilty conscience about having sex outside of marriage, then we get married so we can feel better about ourselves while we do it. Right? Homosexuals didn't come up with that understanding of marriage. That understanding has been promoted by happily fornicating heterosexuals for the past several decades. And now, of course, the homosexuals step up to the plate and say, well, if that's what marriage is about, we can do that. We have just as much right to do that as you do. We can fornicate with the best of them. We can seek the pleasure. We can have the self-gratifying personal relationship. How dare you leave us out? And you know, once you have abandoned the proper and real understanding of marriage, it has a certain logic to it, you got to admit. It does. They just want to get involved, and after all, if part of the whole business is self-gratification, and you can take this step to feel better about yourself, then do it. Is that what marriage was about? It wasn't what marriage was about spiritually or theologically, as we have seen, and it certainly wasn't at all what marriage was about socially either. One of the questions I'm always asking people is, why on earth are people clamoring for a government to step in and regulate their most intimate private friendship? This doesn't seem natural to me. Oh, I mean, most of the time we would want not only government but other people to kind of stay out of our most intimate relationships. That's what intimate means, isn't it? I think. So at one level, clamoring for the government to step in and regulate your friendship. What does that mean? What is government anyway? Government is, in its essence, a manifestation of the collective force of the society. That which can be done and must be done by, at the end of the day, coercion. That's the essence of government. When you have introduced law into the equation, you have introduced an element of coercion. How many of us think that real friendship, the friendship that is supposed to be an expression of the spirit and the soul and the mingling of two beings that reflects the sort of high possibility of their mutual, yes, attraction in some sense, but also their choice for one another. The choice to be trusted, the choice to be loyal, the choice to give to that one an essence of yourself which comes not because of money or profit or any other compulsion, but because you have chosen with your inmost being to offer and extend that friendship to another. That's friendship. That's at the heart of it. Coercion has no place in such a relationship. Coercion seems to be actually totally opposed to it. And yet, here we have a group of people clamoring to introduce government coercion into their friendships. Why? Okay. Well, I can tell you why it happened with the man-woman relationship. It happened because the man-woman relationship, as we have seen, necessarily implies the possibility of the child. And the possibility of the child implies complications from a social point of view. Complications that could be dealt with easily enough in small societies, but have to be regulated in some fashion in larger ones so that you'll know what to expect. Whose child is it? Question number one. Can we assume that it's yours? Don't know. If we can't assume that it's yours, who's responsible for feeding and clothing and taking care of this child? Don't know. If we can't assume that it's yours, does it have a claim when it grows up to your hut, to your property, to your land? Don't know. If we can't assume that it's yours, do your relatives have a responsibility for it, untoward it or not? When it is attacked and injured, must they respond to that offense or not? You think it through, you begin to understand that to define the marriage relationship was essential, in fact, to the orderly peace of society from really its very beginnings in its more complex form. The moment it extended beyond the unitary extended family, it became necessary to start to determine what would be respected as the responsibilities and obligations and authority arising from procreation. And in order to respond to that, societies had to essentially establish a set of understanding. When you intend to do this in such a way as to pass on your claims to another, then you must signify this to us, the society as a whole, so we will recognize and support your claims. And, of course, the claims of your children, which must be then enforced upon you. Okay? Society didn't exist. You know, if people feel better about having sex with each other, because guess what? Prior to more conventional understandings that are imposed after a long train of religious and other forms of moral acculturation, in case you haven't noticed, human beings have an animal nature. And I doubt that animals feel guilty after sex. We have a natural inclination to engage in sex without guilt. The guilt arises as a consequence of our social being, our social nature, a manifestation of that higher order of our being, which makes society possible and makes moral responsibility necessary. Without that, there's not going to be much guilt about sex. Probably won't even remember it the next day if you're a man. Right? No, I'm serious. That's the other reason why marriage exists. Only women in our society are forgetting all about this, because as they are encouraged to forget many other aspects of themselves. I'm willing to bet that the primary impetus for marriage in its beginnings was the quiet demand that women not be confronted by the necessity of meeting all those responsibilities and obligations by themselves. Right? That, of course, required a little time, because it probably required a little time before people realized the role that man had in this. That might be one reason why the Bible is so useful. A little revelation was needed. But in any case, the point is that marriage was a social institution. Institution, by the way. Sort of like the military. When you think of an institution, as such, is something that has its own personality, its own rules, its own discipline, its own requirements, its own aim, its own purpose, apart from that of the individuals who become part of it. So if you join the Army, you make the voluntary choice to join, but that's the last voluntary thing you do for a long while. Montaigne says the same thing about marriage. You enter it by choice, but that's the last choice you get. And of course, this led to all kinds of jokes, the old ball and chain, and all this sort of reference. But you know what that was a recognition of? It was a recognition of the fact that the real point of marriage, from the individual's point of view, was not to say to one other person, oh, I love you, and want to be with you all my life, and all this other stuff that we, with our romantic sort of stuff, we do. That can be part of it. But no, the real point of marriage was a willingness to accept the bondage that was implied by it, the service that was implied by it. And you stood before the society and said, yes, I am ready to take on this responsibility. I declare and affirm by oath that I will do so. And you have the right to enforce it upon me now, because I have so declared it. You took a vow, and you stood before the world to profess that you were willing to be kept to the consequences of that vow. That was marriage. And with no-fault divorce and all this other stuff, we backed away from that understanding. And in doing so, we introduced the controversy that we now face. We laid the groundwork for it, prepared the field for it. And we will not resolve the conflict until we have gotten back to an understanding of marriage that restores its relationship to the fundamental purpose of the institution. Right? Final point on this. What, in its essence, from a Christian point of view, does this whole business of marriage discussion represent? Well, as I said, it represents a rejection of the truth that's presented in Scripture, the authority of God. A rejection of the authority of God that arises from what? From an insistence on viewing sexual relationships in such a way as to suppress the existence of the child and the necessary implications of the child's existence. But you see, this comes, doesn't it, in the context of the fact that this society has already declared the suppression of the child to be a fundamental right. It is no accident that the crisis of marriage occurs in the context of a society that has accepted as a right abortion, which represents, of course, the elimination of the child from the equation of human sexuality, even if the most extreme means are required to do so. We will maintain the fiction that sexuality is only for the gratification of the parties involved, implies no transcendent good or being beyond them, and we will hold fast to this even at the expense of violence, even at the suppression of innocent life. The crisis that we are in, therefore, represents a crisis in which we turn our backs on God's authority, utterly turn our backs on it, and substitute for His choice our choice. That's why the pro-choice phrase is a perfect appellation for the pro-abortion movement. They are in favor of choice, but it's a human choice. It's a choice that therefore provides no foundation for any claim to rights, any claim to dignity, any claim to liberty whatsoever, apart from the power with which that choice can be enforced by any given human being or set of human beings. You realize, of course, that this involves the denial of the very premise of our regime, of our free way of life, which is that there is a transcendent basis for the claim, even of the weakest individuals, to be respected in their dignity. The embrace of abortion involves the denial of this claim. It involves the removal from weakness of the protection that came from the appeal to God as the transcendent authority on which even the weak could base their claim to be respected in their worth and dignity. Right? We have abandoned our principles. We have, by that abandonment, abandoned the premises on which the institution that is vital to our civilization is based. And finally, we have exemplified in this abandonment our willingness to turn our backs on the existence and authority of the God to whom we appealed. At every stage in our history from its beginning, in order to claim and vindicate before the tribunal of conscience our most basic rights. And we think America's going to survive. If the foundations be destroyed, what will the righteous do? Say, well, I don't know what the righteous will do, but I know what the house does. It collapses. Foundational. The authority of the Creator, the claim for rights, foundational. Marriage and the family understood in its relationship to procreation and the responsibilities and obligations entailed to the society. Foundational. We destroyed the foundations, and yet we think the building will survive. Why? Why? Well, see, I think that when you start doing things that are so patently contradictory of the most elementary logic of human reason and common sense, the most charitable explanation is that you've gone mad. And I believe, to be quite honest about it, that this is where we stand. Paths open up. And one of those paths, as Macbeth says, this way, madness lies. And we are already well along the road to that madness. But in social terms, madness and confusion mean dissolution. They mean the loss of that decent order which can be associated with difficulty with liberty. We have managed that difficult association now for quite a while. But as we destroy the foundations of its possibility in the human heart and character and soul, I believe we are coming to the end of that term. That means, my friends, that America, as a free nation dedicated to these principles and based upon an understanding of human beings that allows moral responsibility to be a part of what they are, America is coming to an end. You will, sadly, and I say this as one who, like Moses, won't live to see this happen, as Moses in the Promised Land. Some of you are going to live to lay eyes on this world. You will see its totalitarian reality. You will feel its deep indignity. You will sense the loneliness and isolation that results from its dissolution of the most elementary human social institution. You will know the howling wilderness that results from this enemy, this anarchy, this sense of godlessness. And all you will have to console yourselves is the empty human pride that declares, in the midst of this wasteland, we did it ourselves. I think there's got to be something more to our future than this. But I don't think we get there unless we're willing to confront these realities seriously, think them through completely, and then make a decision. I believe that those who are, as some of us may be, committed to God and Jesus Christ, need to make that decision in light of that commitment. And then to stand as Jesus did, with courage to bear witness to the truth of the Father's existence, the Father's grace, and the Father's love, even though it mean we die. If we can find the courage in our hearts to make that kind of commitment of faith, then I think that our nation, like Christ himself, for all the enormity of this crisis, will not die, but will live again, because we have found, by God's grace, the courage to be truly free. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm told we have time for questions. I can't imagine there are any. No, I take that back. Right, I think the microphones on both sides are working. Yes, on either side you can come to the mic.
Hi. My name is Stas Gish, and I'm actually the president of the College of Democrats here. So this is, I guess, the official Democrats question we're allotted. And I just wish to invite you to our meeting at 8:30 tonight if you'd like to continue the discussion further. I'm sure there's some people who would like to argue with you a little bit. But my question is this, and forgive me for making it a two-part question. One is you've defined marriage as an institution designed to create a child. And you may say that it's not you who has defined it this way, it's God, and I will allow you this. But what of people who cannot have children? Where there is one person in the couple who can and another who cannot, would you say that they are defiling God by not marrying so that they can have children? Or is that, that's part A. Part B is, for those of us who are not Christian and who do not believe in Jesus, why should the government define marriage in a way that is contrary to our religion, considering that there is, after all, an amendment to the Constitution which prohibits Congress from doing that very thing?
Well, step number one, in terms of the first part about heterosexuals who can't have children, I don't quite ever understand the import of those questions as they have to do with our understanding of marriage as such, since we know that human concepts are not defined by the diverse characteristics of every particular. Some apples are big, some apples are small, some apples are red, some apples are green, some apples have this, some apples have that, some apples have worms. Some apples taste good and are sweet, other apples are not, but they are all apples. And the basic and general attributes of apples are not affected in our conceptual understanding by this great diversity. That's what a concept is. It is an abstraction. We abstract from those particulars in order to understand that essence which unites them. See? And what I was discussing here today was the essence of marriage. Even as, the military as an institution. You go into the army as an institution. Oh, human beings come in all varieties. Some people are clerks, and some people are cooks, and so forth and so on. But we don't define the nature of the institution by the clerks and the cooks, do we? Nor do we define the nature of the institutions by the people who may be clerks and cooks, who also have this attribute that they don't like the sight of blood, can't stand the sound of bullets, and would rather be anywhere than on a battlefield. We don't do that, do we? No, because as an institution, the military is defined by the soldier, and the soldier is understood as the warrior, the one who fights the war. The fact that all these other possibilities are part of the army in some sense doesn't change our understanding of what the essence is of that institution. And if it did, we'd have armies that couldn't fight. See? Just as if it did, we have a marriage institution that cannot contribute to its ultimate purpose, which is the stability of the community and the procreation of the species. And I did use the word procreation advisedly, by the way. I don't think we human beings create anything. We procreate. We participate in God's work of creation. Now, as to the question of an understanding of marriage that corresponds to a religious view, I've been trying to explain to people that this is why the Constitution was written the way it was. Marriage is supposed to be, under our Constitution, a state and local issue. Right? We know this. Always has been, and that's where it's supposed to remain. Why? Well, see, I actually think that it's connected with that First Amendment you mentioned. The First Amendment, contrary to what a lot of lying lawyers and judges have tried to pretend over the years, does not say that there can be no establishment of religion in America. That's not what it says at all. Its words are clear. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The word respecting, universally understood to mean on the subject of, with regard to, concerning. Now, come on, y'all. We're about to have a picnic for the college Democrats. And you're put in charge of arranging the picnic, and there's a dispute arises among the members as to whether to have hot dogs at the picnic or not. And your boss, the president of the college Democrats, comes to you and says, look, I believe that we just need to let the people do what they're going to do. So under no circumstances are you to make a decision respecting whether to have hot dogs or not at this picnic. Does that mean they're going to be hot dogs? We don't know, do we? Does that mean that there will be no hot dogs? We don't know, do we? The only thing we know from those words is that you're not supposed to have anything to do with this decision. That's the First Amendment. It tells Congress, and therefore the federal government, that there can be no lawful basis for federal involvement in the issues that arise from the whole subject of an establishment of religion. It is off the table for federal consideration. Where does that leave it? The 10th Amendment is very clear. Powers not delegated to the United States, nor prohibited by the Constitution to the states, are reserved to the states respectively and to the people. It was to be left at the state level. Now, why is this an answer to your question? Obviously, the founders knew that it's really difficult to deal with certain subjects in human affairs if you can't respect the religious beliefs, heart, and faith, at least in a general way, of the people. So you had to leave the handling of those institutions at the level of government in which, under our Constitution, it is explicitly permitted to deal with issues of church and state in a way that accords with the constitutional mechanisms of the states and the decision of the people. That's the way the Constitution wrote it. And that means that, yes, with respect to things like marriage and so forth, within the given states, and probably as the states became more complex within the localities, a majority of the citizens living within that political entity were the ones who were going to determine, through their legislature, what was going to be reflected in their understanding of marriage and other institutions that have, as it were, a content or are haunted by the content of religious conviction and ethics. It was brilliant. They actually came up with a good scheme. The federal judges are ruining the whole thing by, in a totalitarian fashion, attempting to impose a uniform regime of atheism on our entire political system. And as they do so, they are both overturning the Constitution and they are destroying our ability to deal properly with issues like marriage and such. Final point. Because you were referring, I think, to this amendment that's proposed at the national level. And I got to tell you, I'm an old-style conservative. Some of you know this. I believe deeply in federalism. The explanation I just gave you, I think, is correct as to why marriage ought to be handled at the state level. But we have a quandary. It wouldn't be such a quandary if our judges had any common sense at the federal level, but they don't. They have no understanding of the system. And therefore, it is greatly to be feared that if one state adopts something like gay marriage, then that is going to be consciously used to assault every other state, and under the full faith and credit clause, applied without any common sense, that will be used to destroy, against the will of the people, by the way, pretty much all across the country, their commitment to heterosexual monogamous marriage. And by the way, I say monogamous because, come on, we've got to know that we have leapfrogged polygamy. See? In going to gay marriage, we have left polygamy in the rear. Once gay marriage is there, you will not be able to deny polygamy. There is no logical way in which you could do so. Now, if two men have the right to get married and two women do, then one man and two women, also adults, also rationally consenting, also citizens of the United States, also to be respected in their desire to be respectable, they'll claim the same right, and we won't be able to stop them. Okay? That's why I say the whole marriage system in this country will collapse. Not because bad people are getting married. That's nonsense. But because conceptually we will be unable to sustain the marriage institution in any guise whatsoever. It will fall by the wayside. And that's already happening. To deal with the controversy, you can already read. It was in Slate. It's been in other places where people come forward. Why does the government get involved in this at all? But you know why the government gets involved in it? Can I explain that? I know it's a long answer, but it's a long question. The government gets involved in it, y'all, because the marriage-based family was here before the government. The marriage-based family was here, in fact, before civil society as such. The marriage-based family is one of those goods which we agreed to get together to secure when we formed civil society. And the marriage-based family had its own authority and its own prerogatives apart from and separate from any grant of government. And so when we entered into this whole business, we did so on the basis that we were going to get some respect for those things that were really important to us. And the chief among those things in every time and place practically in human affairs was the kinship network. My children, my brother, my sister, my parents. You are going to respect those relationships. When a government declares that it will back away from actual legal acknowledgement of the prerogatives of family life, you know what that means? It means that that government has breached the social contract. It means that in principle, civil society has been dissolved. And I know we think that's just theory, but it's not. Our founders knew otherwise. They knew that at the end of the day, a failure to deal prudently with these questions has led to almost all the most vicious wars in human history. And we will not be exempt if we continue to behave as stupidly as we are now. Yes?
Earlier tonight, you said that the freedoms of this country lies with those who profess themselves to be Christian. And I was wondering, where do those of us who aren't Christian, myself included, fit into your United States of America? Because you seem, in that statement, to be denying the fact that this is my country, too.
No, I never made that statement.
Yes, sir, you did.
No, I didn't. I'm sorry. I know very carefully what I said, and I never said that. The interesting thing, though, is that I do think that the idea of freedom presumes a certain understanding of things. And if you deny that understanding of things, you will destroy the freedom. Can I use an example?
Yes.
I'll use an example, because it's the very issue we've been talking about, the issue of homosexuality. In order for freedom to be possible, it must be possible to conceive of human beings as responsible for their actions and choices. That is to say, I must be able to look at a person, and when that person makes a choice, I must be able to ascribe that choice to the moral will of the person. If that choice was due to some external influence, if it was due to some uncontrollable quality in that person's biology or genetic makeup, if it was something that was utterly beyond their control, then they are not responsible for the result. Their choice was therefore not free, and I cannot hold them accountable for it. See? Now, that understanding of the possibility of human freedom, that you can actually make a choice for which you can be held morally accountable, is absolutely essential to freedom as it is understood in our country. It is the basis, in fact, for the whole idea of the individual that makes the rule of law through legislative processes in which the people are involved possible. See? Because we will act responsibly when we go into the voting booth, and we will respond responsibly to legislation that is made by our representatives, and so forth and so on. What if somebody comes along and adopts a point of view that denies the possibility of that moral choice and denies the possibility of that responsibility? Well, they can live in America, for sure, and they will be treated quite well in America. But if they try to take their understanding and make it the understanding of America, they might have to meet with some resistance, because if we adopt their view, freedom won't be possible anymore. See? And if you don't mind my saying so, I'll use homosexuality as an example. One of the arguments often made about homosexuality, which I always found intriguing over the years, for obvious reasons, was that this was some aspect of the civil rights struggle. There are even black leaders in this country who have adopted this nonsense. That's because they haven't thought about it. See? What are you saying when you say that homosexuality is like race? Well, I at least could sit here and I could will it all day, but guess what? The behavior of my little skin cells are not going to change. They are what they are. Anybody who would suggest that I am somehow morally responsible for the color of my skin is, as we all know, sick and liable to be extremely bigoted. Being a black American is not a moral condition. And to react to it as if it implies some wickedness, some evil, that was the very heart of bigotry, as we all know. Now, what if homosexuality is like this? What are we saying? Well, we're saying that at the very least, inclination is uncontrollable. Well, I'll be honest with you. Inclination doesn't matter. Inclination doesn't matter from the point of view of the law and the polity. You can have whatever inclination you like. The question then becomes action. That's the only thing one has to look at from the point of view of moral responsibility, because what you're inclined to do is between you and God. What you actually do is a subject of judgment about moral responsibility in society. So, the question then becomes, what about action? Well, if action is in fact not necessary in response to this inclination, then to actually act upon one's homosexual inclination is a free choice. If it's a free choice, it's a choice that I can hold you morally accountable for. I can approve or disapprove of it. And it's not bigotry. It's moral judgment. Same way as I approve or disapprove of other human actions that have moral implications that I can argue for. On the other hand, if we accept the notion that it is bigotry to respond in a way that morally reacts to or condemns the homosexual, well, then we've said that the action that results is an action that the homosexual can't be held morally responsible for. But whoa, let's wait a minute here. What are we talking about here? We're talking about sexual passion, aren't we? Or the desire for physical pleasure and all in a certain way, an inclination. And we've just made the statement that a human being is not responsible for the actions that result from that passion? You realize, don't you, that when we make that statement, we haven't made a statement about a homosexual, we've made a statement about a human being. And we have denied to that human being the possibility of responsible moral choice in the face of his or her passions. What is the implication of that denial? The implication of that denial is that we are dealing with a person who is not free, with a person who is in fact in bondage to the passion. And therefore we must simply find ways to regulate and channel and otherwise deal with the passion so that that individual will not be harmed, can find some fulfillment, and the rest of us can be okay. But you can't hold them more accountable. Somebody's going to have to explain to me someday, though, why I should look upon the passion with respect to this kind of pleasure of a homosexual any differently than I look upon the passion with respect to this kind of passion of anybody else in the society. You go through this silly argument about whether it's in the genes and so forth. Excuse me for saying so. I think that we would all generally acknowledge that the stuff that has to do with the pleasure we derive from these particular organs of our body is biological and it's genetic, and we're all inclined to it. See? Yeah. I'm married. I've been married for some years now. Have children and all. Do you think that in some way this exempts me from that little start of lustful inclination when I see a really beautiful woman? No, I don't think it does. No. The understanding is that I will refrain from allowing my will to give assent to that inclination, but the inclination is part of my makeup. It is the law in my members, as St. Paul calls it. And that's going to be there. We all have it. The notion that only homosexuals have the law in their members, and only homosexuals are somehow subject to a passion that inclines them to do this or that, that's nonsense. We all are. And if we accept the argument that their particular passion is somehow exempt from the understanding of ourselves that makes moral accountability possible, then we will exempt all of us from it. Because there is no essential difference between that passion and other passions. And that means that we haven't just adopted a view of homosexuality, we've adopted a view of human nature. And that view of human nature says that human beings are subject to passions they cannot in any particular instance control. And that being that that is the case, what form of government is suitable to people who are like that? Certainly not a form of government where they get to choose things because they're not choosing, their passions are choosing. And that's going to lead to some terrible consequences when those passions clash and they irresistibly run after them. That's the way society was, actually, for a long while. Yeah. Passion of anger, the passion of greed, the passion of jealousy. Acting on those passions led to violence and war and anarchy. We had to, in order to get out of that, we had to make some assumptions about what we were capable of, and we had to develop on the basis of those assumptions a capacity for controlling the passions. And people might say, well, yeah, you control the passions, but you don't have to just give up on everything. I mean, are you asking that these folks should just give up on sexuality because of their inclination? Well, excuse me for saying so. That's not entirely a true statement. I am told in all the different things that I've read over the years about our background as human beings that all of us have an inclination to anger. We have an inclination when we are feeling resentful and put upon to go out and kill people. As I recall, one of the requirements of living in society together is that we keep that particular passion under control at all times. It is part of our makeup, but we never get to give into it without culpability. Okay? Now, that means that, yes, abstinence from certain kinds of passions that are contradictory of our social condition and so forth. So that's to be expected. It's part of what it means to be human. But my whole point in this is that one can take different views than we take. My question isn't that somebody who is of a different religious persuasion, has a different understanding of human nature, they can't live in America and be free. Of course they can. A matter of fact, America is probably the place where they are liable to live and be free. The point is, however, that if we adopt their understanding of things, then America cannot be free. And there's a difference here. This is the one thing I've never understood about this whole movement. That people would come forward and ask that we should embrace an understanding of ourselves that destroys the foundation of liberty for everyone in the society, also that they can feel better about a sexual indulgence that I and you wouldn't even care about if they just minded their own business about it. And this seems to me as utterly selfish and totally unfair. And I reject the notion that it is somehow wrong to reject the demands of selfish people who would sacrifice the whole good of society in order to feel better about their own indulgence. Yes?
There are just a few things that I'd like some clarity on. I've thoroughly enjoyed your talk, but just for my further understanding, you mentioned freedom of choice and a Trinitarian concept of completeness in order to fully reflect God's image. What about those in certain religious orders who take on a vow of chastity or celibacy? Are they incapable of reflecting that image? And I also have a second question. I hope I'm not being piggy with the microphone here.
You're not. That's a good question.
But you mentioned both polygamy and the fact that marriage should be decided by states and local communities. And yet it was the federal intervention in Utah that destroyed the institution of polygamy there. Is this an example where the Constitution has failed states' rights in the respect of marriage?
Very good question, the latter. If I forget it while I'm answering the first one, remind me of it, because it's very important. But the first one, I think, has an easy answer. Why, in anything that I said, would one assume that the only way in which the Trinity is reflected in our nature is the physical manifestation? I think the physical manifestation of the Trinity in our nature is probably the most universal reflection. It's the one that all human beings, in some sense, have, as it were, the equipment for. But there are other ways, obviously. Because we are talking about something that, with respect to God, is it physical? Well, I think most of us don't think so. So what is it? It would have to do with something that transcends the physical. And we have aspects to our nature that seem to do so. Our spirit, our intellectual processes. That means that there are various ways of reflecting in who we are and what we do this mystery, if you like, that is reflected in this being. And I think that ultimately, even when we're talking about human sexuality, how can I put this delicately? I don't know. Can we assume that Adam and Eve had bodies like ours? I'm just not sure. See? I'm just not sure. We make this assumption fairly easily, but after the fall, we were very different. And they did seem capable of some things we're not capable of, but and so forth and so on. The reason I raise it is that I think we need to be careful about acting as if the discussion of what goes on between Adam and Eve necessarily implies what we understand as human sexuality. It could also, if you think it through, and I've actually done this a little bit, it could also apply to a relationship of beings through which the self-consciousness that characterizes our humanity emerges. In which case, you would be talking about something that wasn't physical at all, but intellectual and metaphysical. You see what I'm saying? But all of that suggests that there are various ways of reflecting this aspect of God, and one of those ways, if what I just said about self-consciousness and reason is true, would be rational endeavors, wouldn't it? It would be intellectual pursuits. But there's another way of expressing it, because it might also be something that happens at a spiritual level. It might be something that happens at the level at which matter and the non-material interact. Sort of like dance, right? And that would mean that in the arts and in other things, it is possible to manifest this aspect of our humanity. In some sense, that's what I think it means for us to give praise to God. To give praise to God means that we not only have this sexual way of reflecting the mysterious being of God, we can reflect that being in all other pursuits if we are dedicated to and willing to accept by grace our relationship with God. So, of course, it can be manifest in orders. It can be manifest in classrooms. It can be made manifest in civic organizations and so forth and so on. Because at some level, the mandate that we have to care about one another is made possible. Why? Because though I am one and you are another, yet just as Adam and Eve are conscious of the potential unity that manifests their humanity even despite their distinction, so one and another we stand on the common ground of our humanity. And that means that every act of compassion, every act of love we show for one who is, maybe not our physical brother and sister, yet united to us in this common bond of our humanity. Every such act would then be, like Adam and Eve's relationship, a manifestation of this mysterious relationship that exists between the distinct persons of God. Distinct personhood that does not in any way deny the possibility of our community. And that would finally lead to what? The conclusion that what we do for the sake of that community is especially like what we do in the presence of this distinction that nonetheless acknowledges the unity of God. And that's why I think at the end of the day Aristotle was right. Because we are made in the image and likeness of God, we are social beings, made to exist not in isolation, not alone, okay, but in our relations with one another, but relations that must acknowledge at the end of the day that though we are one and another, yet at some level we are one. And in that oneness we manifest our humanity, and in that humanity we make manifest our God.
That concludes our question and answer session with Dr. Alan Keyes. And we would actually, on a lighter note, like to ask Dr. Alan Keyes what he thinks about the current presidential election. And
That's a lighter note, yeah.
a lighter note from our current discussion right now, and your thoughts on the presidential race right now.
Well, it depends on what you mean by my thoughts on the presidential race. I mean, my personal preference is obviously clear. I mean, I'm a Republican, and I sincerely hope that Bush gets reelected. I have to make clear, though, because I'm perfectly honest about this, I am not an enthusiastic supporter of G.W. Bush. I'm one of those conservatives who's really unhappy with him. But all things considered, I don't believe I can sacrifice the security of this country to my unhappiness. And I believe that the security of this country does have a necessary relationship to the present election, because I'm not at all convinced that Democrats have the necessary commitment to that security. They helped to get us into this mess with their failure to understand during the Carter and Clinton years that human intelligence is absolutely essential to security. And so that failure is, I think, part of what puts us in this terrible position that we're in. On the other hand, if you're just talking about it from an analytical point of view, I actually think that Bush is going to have a hard time. And the reason I think so is that he faces a challenge. He must make the election a referendum on the issue of security and his performance in addressing it. If that's what people are thinking about when they go into the voting booth, they will vote more often than not for G.W. Bush. If they are no longer willing to give priority to that security concern, then I think Kerry and the Democrats stand a very good chance of redefining the choice in such a way that they can blame Bush for some of the aspects of our life and situation that are probably attributable to that very fact that, though we don't want to think about, we're at war. You know, war usually means that times are a little bit tougher than they would otherwise be. Right now, they're a lot less tough than they've usually been in the midst of American wars, but it's still there. But if we forget that we're at war, then we're going to blame the president and not the war, and I think that Kerry will benefit from that.
Well, I thank you all very much for coming. On behalf of College Republicans who co-sponsored this event with UGBC, I would like to thank you all for coming. I would like to thank Luke Howe for setting up this event. I think he deserves a round of applause right now.